right, let's look at a new draft policy. Government releasing this gazette proposing a 6-month ban on the export of scrap and waste metal. Now, it is hoped that this would cut down dramatically on the theft of copper cables, which, as we've reported on for a long time, has contributed to power cuts and even the dismantling of rail and other important infrastructure in this country. To discuss, we're joined by Donald Mackay, CEO of XA International Trade Advisors. Mr. Mackay, thank you for being with us. Firstly, do you mind giving us some insight about the scrap metal market? Who buys, who sells, how much is exported, because this would be about exports, and how much of it is stolen?
Well, the last question is really hard to answer because, of course, if it's stolen, it's a criminal act, and we have no idea who's doing it. But let me start with the others then. So we collect in the order of about 3.8 million tons of scrap metal a year, which is split between ferrous scrap and non-ferrous. We export about 15% of that. So the bulk of the scrap metal is consumed inside of South Africa. And the bulk of the generation of scrap actually comes out of our SOEs. Legitimately, I'm talking about not stolen now. So a Transnet, Eskom, etc., would sell their scrap metal on auction. It would be bought by consumers of scrap, or it would be bought by recyclers who would then on-sell it to somebody else or possibly export it.
And what would they use it for?
Well, all sorts of things. If you take a company like Score Metals, which is probably the largest consumer of ferrous scrap, they would melt it down, they would turn it into a product like rebar or some other kind of construction steel. So that's what you would do with steel. With copper, you would manufacture electric components, that sort of thing, even down to things like copper cable, which is, again, put back into circulation.
And copper cables are some of the things being stolen. I like the way you put it, that for a year, until June this year, 54 rugby fields of scrap were traded, which just gives a picture of the size of the trade. The question is now, in the short term, that's what's proposed, will a 6-month ban on the export of the metal work? So you're saying only 15% or so is exported, and you're skeptical. Tell us why.
Yeah, for a few reasons. So we had a ban of 3 months in 2020, which didn't appear to have an impact. So I'm not sure that doubling the period is going to have any more impact. But also, because most scrap metal is not exported, it follows probably that most stolen scrap metal is also not exported. So if the ratio remains the same, we're going to have, at best, a 15% impact, which doesn't really take us anywhere to resolving the problem. It also doesn't stop the theft. It just stops one potential outlet, and not even the biggest one. So no, I've got no reason to think it would work. But the economic impact would be quite horrifying. There are a lot of people that depend for their living on collecting scrap. You see these guys with their huge trolleys piled high. They're dependent on a good scrap price. If we remove the export market, the price of scrap will fall, and it's not clear how they would then earn an income.
So there's basically more competition locally then, because the scrap is not being exported. So before we look at what can be done, I mean, internally, are the buyers knowing that they're buying stolen copper cables, for example? Is that obvious? And is it all done on a black market? Are there bribes if it crosses borders? Or is this just about the buyers not knowing which metal comes from where and what's legitimate and what's not?
Yeah, I think perhaps on a small scale, someone might be fooled. But I would think on the scale our infrastructure has been stolen, that the buyers would have to be part of the process, probably even before the theft takes place. So I would be very surprised if anybody could pitch up at a scrap yard with hundreds of meters of copper cable and find a ready buyer. I would think it's part of a syndicate, and I would guess whoever might be melting it down locally or processing it further so that it's no longer identifiable as scrap. I would think they're part of the process right from the beginning.
Yeah. And what about crossing borders? I mean, could this still be sort of smuggled across, even if there is an export ban?
Yeah, so I don't think people develop a conscience at the border and then declare everything correctly to customs. So, one must assume that even the people now that are exporting stolen product are probably not declaring it as such. It also makes sense that rather than export the product as the stolen materials such as the cable, you might decide to melt it down first. And in the melted down form, it's of course completely untraceable. Once it enters the furnace, who knows what happens to it.
The government also proposing an export permit system for semi-finished metal products. But if it's melted down, then it's no longer semi-finished. So they wouldn't be able to identify that either.
Yeah, we'd have to see exactly how that looks. But I would think a lot of that would simply not be identifiable. So I think it would have to go a step further. We're thinking of, for example, getting government to register all of the furnaces that are currently in use so that at least they know where every furnace is. It would just make it far easier for the police, for example, to do inspections if you know where to go.
Yeah.
So the amount of control that's required over scrap metal is considerably higher than the amount of control you need if you're going to smelt the scrap. And that difference, I would think, would push a lot of the stolen material into the sector that has less control.
All right, let's end there. I mean, we all want a solution to this problem. It was just heartbreaking to see infrastructure being stolen even during the unrest that we saw last year. So targeting the smelters, or at least monitoring them, would that make a difference? What else?
Yeah, I think it would make a difference. We have to try to work out where the problem is. And we do think a big part of the problem is with the policing. So we no longer have specialized units, for example. We used to have the copperheads beforehand, which were in the Cape looking particularly for stolen material. Those specialized units are no longer there. I think an investment in training and having specialized people in the police in itself would make a difference in dealing with the problem.
All right, thank you for your assessment tonight. That was Donald Mackay, CEO of XA International Trade Advisors.